page, but welcome everybody. And first off, I want to take the opportunity to thank DIT and for the opportunity to present to you today. You'll see a cool little logo there on the top. That's the State Interoperability Executive Committee, which has representation from voice and data partners, which is a really good thing. So today we're going to talk about information sharing. We're going to talk about public safety communications networks, info security, that type of stuff. But mostly, I think Carly and I really want to dig into the expectation management, both prior to and then following some type of compromise. So we're going to get going. So this is, thank you, Albert, for those introductions. And thank you for kind of keeping that short and sweet. We like to get into the meat and potatoes of the presentation. But I cruised through the list of attendees, and there's some folks in there that we know very well, and thank you guys for joining and taking the time out of your days. And first off, kind of from my perspective, I am not an IT professional, which I hope to express that and kind of give you my view of what I think you all do. And then what's great about Carly is she sees both sides of this. So she is an IT professional, and then also a search and rescue tech and amongst other things in the public safety world. I do also want to call out Mr. Matt Runyon with Cisco Crisis Response. He contributed to this presentation. And for those of you that do not know Matt Runyon, he is also an Apex firefighter, and so he also knows kind of both sides of the operation here. So Carly, I'll let you kind of just jump in and say hi.
Morning, everyone. Hopefully you've all had at least one cup of coffee and or energy drink for those of you non-coffee drinkers. I know I'm on my second, so bear with me through the process, but I'm excited to talk with you all. And if you feel comfortable, I don't know if you guys have the permission to turn on your camera, but it'd be awesome to see your faces. But I completely understand if not, and you're one of those working from home sweatpants people for the conference. I've been there, so just happy to have you on. If you have any questions after the fact or just want to connect after, our emails are in the presentation. Please feel free to reach out after the fact. And I won't belabor or talk about myself too much. I'm just excited to get in and share some information, and hopefully you guys find the presentation entertaining at a minimum, if not informative. So Greg, sir, you have the floor.
Thanks, Carly. I appreciate that. Yeah, so just kind of, in the spirit of things, just outline a goal before we get going. So we want to provide you guys with a broad look at public safety communications, both information sharing, both goods, what we've seen, and then, some gaps that we've seen, and then vulnerabilities, obviously, when we talk about consequence management following some type of cyber event. So as with any presentation, specifically this one being in a cyber environment and what we're talking about, this is a TLP white. However, I do see some a couple of call-in numbers. So obviously with that, we don't want to be giving away the kernel secret recipe, and we want to keep it kind of high level without getting into a secure environment or any other type of secure information. So that is our goal. All right, so moving to objectives for today is we want to kind of provide common gaps as identified in previous events, trainings, exercises, things where we've gotten smart people together, both on the public safety side and on the IT side. And then we want to kind of provide that insight into processes after an event or after a disaster in certain terms, or both, right? A cyber incident may turn into a disaster in the public safety world. So that's kind of what we're going to go after today. And at any point, please stop, drop a question in the chat. We'll do our best, if we'll try and grab those and address them as we go. And again, Carly and I are audience participation people, so we may throw out and target some questions and get your ideas because we learn together in the spirit of emergency management. Our job in our world is to have the largest Rolodex and to get the most input going into any type of adversarial, whether that's a cyber, man-made, natural disaster, any of that. So the time to meet people is not while the disaster is occurring. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. Disclaimer up front, this presentation is not intended to cast judgment on any first response or IT entities. So we're giving examples. If we give examples, they're intended to show lessons learned, not spotlight what the issue was, okay? So just want to be clear about that. So the mission of public safety. in North Carolina. In general, for those of you that may not be in North Carolina, in general, public safety is there to ensure the safety of the public. Right? I'm gonna keep it simple, person. We want to make sure everyone is safe, whether that's people traveling through, whether that is citizens, visitors, whatever that may be. We want to make sure people are safe. All right, so there's kind of a flow chart, if you will, in our world. You know, something is happening. What that is, we don't really know. It could be it's happening right now across North Carolina. Something is happening. Then a citizen or someone in the public needs to access help, right? And then help is sent, problem solved, then we return to normal. Today we're going to focus on those two first. So recognizing a need and then accessing public safety, okay? So we want to kind of start by, we want to kind of identify gaps up front, right? But so we're going to identify, you know, we kind of know what public safety's mission is right now. Now we want to kind of go into IT's mission, and then kind of the common missteps or miscommunications between first responders and IT, right? So we're on the same team here, and we want to kind of go after what the thought process is, right? Day-to-day stuff. So we wanted to take a good opportunity to expose these and to talk about them in this environment, right? So first responders in general, which I'll kind of speak on behalf of, is first responders want to fix an issue as quick as possible, right? They want to fix an issue, they want to move back, or they want to go on back to another issue, and so on and so forth. So that's how they're going to carry out their day. So in the IT world, it's more of it's a short fix environment, if you will, right? And then kind of conversely, the IT professionals in that world, it's the focus is on you know short and long-term fixes. So there's processes there. There's you know you often have to have that long-term fix in mind, even if you're in incorporating a short-term fix. So I think.
So I'll chime in a little bit here too
please.
from the IT perspective side. So I know we've got a mix of people on. So for all those IT people, I'm sure you can relate. We mostly call it like a change management process. So we'll talk a little bit about, as we get into the presentation, one of the biggest barriers that we see between public safety communications and IT communications is verbiage. So IT people tend to be very granular, very detail oriented. You know, you say one word and that can mean something completely different in cyberspace than it does in the public safety world. So a lot of times, you know, we'll get calls like, my email's down, you know, someone's attacking us. From the public safety side, right? From people that are normally used to, if something fails, you know, there's a bad guy or a bad girl and like something is happening and we have to immediately put that Band-Aid on it, like Greg said, or a lot of times we say stop the bleeding. So a tourniquet on a hemorrhage is an example we give a lot. Some of that can definitely cross over into the IT space, right? So if you are actively detecting, you know, an active ransomware event, well, you probably are going to remove immediately from the network. So that's kind of like putting that patch or that Band-Aid over, you know, the situation, but you haven't really assessed the full problem. But a lot of times in the IT space, you know, there's policies in place for, okay, this is a critical vulnerability. We have, say, 24 hours or 48 hours to implement the change. In the public safety world, patience is not always a virtue. I will say, especially as Greg kind of highlighted it before, we didn't go into the bio, but for the last 8 years, I've been a search and rescue technician, swift water rescue technician. So before I got into really cyber security specifically, you know, I was on the boats out for Hurricane Matthew, pulling people out of water. So I can relate to that immediate, quick, urgent need versus it is urgent, it's very critical, but you need to be methodical in how you proceed, because if you make this one change, right, now we're going to break every business operation function that we have an application, and now people are more mad and the disaster is worse. So I just wanted to make that very clear for those of you that may be public safety on the line, speaking kind of not necessarily on behalf of IT professionals, but from my experience as an IT professional, there is a pretty big difference there. Thank you, Greg.
No, you hit the nail on the head, you know, and I think also in the IT world where kind of first responders kind of may not understand is, you know, some fixes may involve money. You know, there may be a cost factor in these things. So I think So that is a common gap that we see is like, hey, you know what? We can just fix this. We'll do, we'll take a crack at it ourselves, and we'll talk about that in a second. So, and kind of as we move on, in fact, there is maybe a similar approach between first responders and IT professionals, right? So we're, I think we have more common ground than we might think. So I think the expectations is uh, who can authorize a process, who can authorize those things. So first responders take a fix a problem following a guideline and then improvise if we need to. So there's a set way that first responders go out into a life-saving or a hazard mitigation environment. And then they have the room to improvise. Maybe that's not the case in the IT professional world. Follow a process and improvise when needed in accordance with certain policies and procedures. Again, it's there, but we sometimes we don't necessarily understand that. So,
Yeah, I'll add to, I would say from the IT space, that improvising that I've seen from my experience sometimes comes in to actual incident response. So you'll have, a set of protocols or right and left limits, if you will, that you can do, especially when you're looking at things like making sure you're doing forensic image captures, you have appropriate chain of custody so that you can maybe actually trace, things like IP addresses or domains attached to, the actual cyber criminal or the hacktivist, et cetera. But some of the improvising kind of comes into that threat hunting landscape. So for public safety, a lot of what that means is, say you have the bad event, let's just say ransomware, because that's probably one of the worst events you could have. Takes down your system. You've got your IT response professionals that have come in. They could also have third-party vendors. Maybe you call us, the Joint Cybersecurity Task Force, and we're there supporting you in your efforts. But we send out. There's different groups of people with subject matter experts in the IT space. So one IT professional is not the same as the other IT professional. And I think that's really important for public safety professionals to understand from the IT side. So just like you have, an operations section chief, and you have Greg Hauser, who's the SWIC, the Statewide Interoperability Coordinator, who specializes in communication platforms. It's the same with IT. You have your programmers, you have your web developers, you have your data analytics, you have your threat intel, and then you also have your incident responders. And then within incident response, you've got threat hunters, forensic imaging gurus, then you have your actual like FBI investigators. So it's very similar, like Greg said, like the actual way we're set up, the way we think, the way we respond is very similar. It's just applied differently. So threat hunting, just for those that may not know, is something like you're going to go in and you're going to try to figure out what's going on. So you're looking for things like log files or indicators of compromise within your systems or within your network. And that's where you can a lot of times improvise. So a lot of times people will write what we call YARA rules, or they'll try to get creative in their coding and their command line to actually find certain indicators in which bad guys like to hide. Because what we're seeing is that the guys we're trying to fight, right, guys and girls that we're trying to fight, are getting more and more sophisticated and more creative and clever in covering their tracks. So there is some improvising, but I mostly, in my experience, have seen it kind of in that space within those right and left limits. Thanks, Greg.
No, that's a good point. So, something for you guys to think about as we go through, why are those limits in improvisation? Why do you think that's important for your organization to recognize and maybe talk about and maybe put in a process or a policy so everyone's kind of on the same page? So just tossing that out there. So I'm 100% guilty of this, and I think the important part from our perspective, from my perspective, it representing kind of the first response communications piece, is that we're terrible at asking for help. If we ask for help, it's almost like it's not fixed. It's been 20 minutes and needs to be fixed, right? So if that's the case and it's not fixed, well, I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to click buttons and click on links and drop and drag files and share files over non-approved. So I think if for our IT professionals, specifically you guys on the line, that's going to be a challenge, right? That is a communication gap, and I know everyone on this call has experienced it. And for our folks in academia, you will experience it when you get out into the profession. So I think the from the first response element is they could be making it worse, as they think they're helping, they think they're trying to trying to push the solution forward when indeed you're fighting your own a teammate there. So and I think I think from a key for the IT professionals is anticipate this, and in turn anticipate potentially a public safety or a first response need. Right? What are the things that we can maybe get a quick fix on to kind of fill that void, and then set that expectation with the first response community to say, this stuff is going to be broken for a little bit. Got to be patient. Work with us here. We got to work on this. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about pace plans and backups and things like that, and consequence management. So that's kind of I'm guilty of that, and I apologize. So, and then common ground, in the first response community is all they do over there at IT is complain, and then the IT professional is the same thing. All they do over there at the fire department or the police department, all they do is complain, right? So we have common ground. So that is a truth, right? And I think one of the things that Matt Runyon was trying to express to us when we were putting this slideshow together, that there is equally as much complaining in firehouses as there is IT shops. But I think his claim to fame and his kind of his thing is we can all agree on coffee, right? So why don't we get together at any of those, whether it's in the IT shop or if it's at the fire station, why don't we all get together and share a cup of coffee? I think that'll help us kind of move forward as far as setting those expectations, understanding what each other does and what the products that we can provide to each other and how they can help us moving forward if we are affected by an event there. So our recommendations before we kind of go into some specifics and some vulnerabilities is I think agree on the solution, not the problem. I think IT professionals sometimes may not understand the why of a public safety request, and I think the public safety space doesn't understand that the IT professionals may need that why, right? Because it's gonna follow a process, right? So I think agree on potential solutions, right? And then communicate expectations and find a common adversary. So we may be, all of us may be waiting on something out of our control. Commercial voice and data, fiber providers, the people that provide those services, we may be waiting on that. That might be an issue rather than asking why is it taking them so long. That I think there's some common ground there. And then I think my position is the state interoperability coordinator. All right, so my job is to get people together communicating, right? Interoperability, human interoperability is more important than any technology, any process that we could possibly have, right? So establish lines of communications. Where does certain information get exchanged, right? Then how, when, and at what point? What triggers are there that are going to require that line of communications between first response and IT professionals? So I think there are, in first response, there are chains of command, right? There are communications that happen at a higher level and that gets filtered down. Is that the same in the IT world? Maybe, maybe not. Something to share over a cup of coffee, right? And for those of you that don't know, the incident command structure, or ICS, it works. And if you're not sure, there's some really good online courses that you can take through FEMA, ICS 100 and 200 and 700 and 800. You can get in and kind of understand what public safety or first responders, what the process that they follow, where there's a chain of command, et cetera. So I think and a point that Mr. Runyon wanted to make was there is proven value in IT staff, IT professionals learning how ICS works, right? And then how to interface with relevant folks. Sometimes we get someone on the phone and then you start passing them information. Well, and it come to find out that person has no idea what you're talking about and they never pass that message to the person that actually needed it. So form those lines of communications prior to. and then and then being methodical, it works. So for example, in first response, in EMS, if you didn't write it down, it never happened, right? So if you take an action on a patient, that never happened, right? How can we equate that to an IT ticketing process to help IT professionals follow that? If you didn't put a ticket in, it never happened, right? That's a common gap in misunderstanding in the first responder world. So there's just some quick recommendations from us, all right? So now we're going to talk specifically about some vulnerabilities that we've seen, and what Carly has been heavily involved in most of these situations. So we're going to kind of give you the so now what? So something has happened, so now what? All right. So as a society, we are connected to technology on a daily basis, right? So I think you all know the vulnerabilities to cellular voice and data networks. We are reliant on a whole host of things. This is a cybersecurity discussion or a symposium, but it could be Betty or Billy Backhoe that digs up a fiber line that crushes your networks, right? How do we take that vulnerability and turn it into a strength, right? So I want, if you don't get anything out of this, is please recognize your vulnerabilities within your agencies and your entities, whether it's municipal, state government, whether it's non-government, whether it's elections or public education. How do your agencies communicate without voice and data networks? We are very over reliant on those networks. I will tell you that. So just an example is how do you get your internal governmental notifications out if there is no notification avenue? There's no pathway for that, right? And how about your no notice events? Christmas Day in Nashville, somebody decides to do harm on a brick building with no windows, right? And I think you guys know what those are. So I think the importance here is do you have it's called a PACE plan. It's a military term that has been crossed over into the first responder world. But PACE plans, primary, alternate, contingent, and emergency. Think about that in your space of, can I fill each one of these lanes with a communication method? And then how do I practice and train on that? So just a little advice there. So from the I guess the vulnerability side of this, in my opinion, this is Greg Hauser's opinion, I think our public safety answering points or emergency communication centers in our communities are a very, very vulnerable link. I would say almost our weakest link. And I say that guardedly because there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle. But for those of you that don't know, a PSAP is where people, that's the act of taking a call, a 911 call, processing it, and dispatching help to people that need it. So how does your 911 center for our state and local IT professionals, do you know how your PSAP operates in an integrated environment? Do you know what the processes are? Do you know how staffing works? Do you know what expectations are as far as restoration, priority of restoration? What is that? If everything is in a zero comms environment, do we focus on 911 calls? Do we focus on computer aided dispatch? What do we do? I can tell you, being in a 911 center when the lights turn off and all the computers turn off, that is not a good place to be. It's a very vulnerable place to be. So please take that into consideration. Have those difficult discussions about what constitutes a bad day in your jurisdiction. It's okay to talk about that stuff. And it's okay to talk about that stuff over a cup of coffee with the 911 center folks, 911 center management. So definitely encourage you to do that. And in turn,
hey Greg, I'd
go
like
ahead,
to jump in real quick. So I think this is a good place to talk a little bit about a couple of the PSAP incidences in which we've actually worked from a Joint Cybersecurity Task Force, just maybe to help paint some of the picture if you guys weren't already tracking. So an example is we had a pretty large level telephone denial of service happen about a year and a half ago with a county in North Carolina. And this happened for a span of about 2 weeks, off and on, and it actually was pretty complex. They had like a robocaller. There were other physical instances of things occurring in addition to the telephone denial of service, but it actually did actively interrupt their ability to do their business functions. Some days I think it was more than 4 hours, 5 hours in which they were constantly busy across their network for being able to actually receive public citizen calls for 911. So that's an example of one. A lot of the things that we see that most of the ones that we see that impact PSAPs are actually the way in which county or government infrastructure is connected to the PSAP and whether or not they're connected to the same network or have any what we would call, trusts across the network. So, for example, in probably I'd say about 80% of the local government, so municipal and county government responses that we've had for cyber incidences in the past 2 years, about 80% of the PSAPs were in some way impacted because they had either a trust or they sat on the same, local area or wide area network as the actual domains that were impacted or the network that was impacted by a ransomware event. So at most of the time, they had to go to paper cards. And I would say they would be on paper cards for probably anywhere from 3 days to up to a week in some of the cases before services could be restored. Another way in which the PSAPs have been impacted that we've seen are almost all of your ambulances or fire services and even your sheriff's offices and local law enforcement have MDT systems. So your mobile device terminals that fit into their vehicles that allow them for GPS, allow them to get CAD data. So that would be like call outs for emergency data or reporting data, or for your deputies, that would be things like we call 27s, mode data terminal. Thank you. Your systems like for checking safety, so officer safety. So a lot of times, when you get pulled over and you run a license plate, all these warnings are connected into those databases that usually are VPN'd back to the actual county infrastructure network. So if the county infrastructure network or the city or the municipality, network is down, then that too is down. So I just kind of wanted to give an example for some of those who may not have experienced that firsthand. Another one was we had a county who was down for approximately a month and a half from a ransomware event, and their entire PSAP was off for a week and a half. And during this event, that also impacted their anti-alley data. So we had a critical law enforcement event that happened during the same time as a cyber incident, and we didn't have call-in data from the person in which we were trying to track down. So I just wanted to give a little bit of some of the examples that we've experienced to kind of help paint a picture of the range and the variety of how and why it matters. Thank you.
No, you're right on, Carly. So I think, anti-alley is a means for a 911 center to find out what number a person's calling from and the location that they're calling from. Both external networks that the internal PSAP network goes out and dips, and then it sends a return back. So it's things to consider, right? There's a lot of networks out there that are connected, and I think we've got some examples of them up on the board. But do you know what process are connected to what networks? And I think we've, in our experience, with the reactionary piece of this and the consequence management piece, is that we're finding that folks may not necessarily understand where those things go, and that leads to kind of the a tree root mentality of, gosh, we found this is going all the way out to this location here. So also I'm going to run all the way back to public safety folks and use Carly's example of an MDT. Do you think that a first responder could potentially do harm by clicking links and files and grabbing files from an MDT? Think about that, right? And then you multiply that times 8 ambulances that are on the street, and then a text message between ambulance folks saying, hey, if you click on this, it'll work again. And then you have that over and over. So just an expectation management piece there. Okay.
Which, by the way, that did actually happen.
Yep.
He's using a real example that did actually happen.
Right, and then assume that communications, the lines of communications are running away from you, as an IT professional, right? Because we've already kind of established in our previous slides, we're running a parallel between public safety communications pathways and then IT professional pathways, right? At some point, those are going to have to intersect, and that point where they intersect has got to be quick. It's got to be sooner than later. And how that is done is a process you may want to look into. How do we do that, right? In disaster communications in general, we immediately start to have a face down. I call it a face down mentality. So we want to get into a solution, and we want to go after it as soon as possible and really attack it. My advice is to pick your head up, look around, and communicate in a one up and one down environment. So communicate down to people that you will potentially be impacting, and then talk up to a management level or a elected official level appropriately with what the status is. That'll hopefully cut down on some of those. Hey, what's going on? What do we do? Those things. So we just put some concerns up there, from our perspective, and we want to make sure immediate consequence management processes are being put in place. Remember, safety of the public, number one, and then sharing open lines of communications with staff. So what do we tell people without inciting fear and sense of unknown for folks? And that could be a whole separate presentation, a whole hour-long process just on that. And I'm going to let, I think for us, once someone in your community calls 911 and they're unable to get through, and then a series of people start to see that, it will be on social media, right? It will be hitting social media, and it'll start to run away. So just be aware of that, right? So getting into the cyber response area, where I become a complete bystander and a support mechanism for all of you guys on the line, is where I help. So Carly, take it away.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, so Greg alluded to it a little earlier, but we're more alike than we like to think. So IT does have a cyber incident response process, and there's a couple different versions of buckets between, NIST or SANS incident response, or if any of you do CompTIA courses, they're a little slightly different, but they all basically say the same thing. It's very similar to public safety. So prepare, so that's plans, protocols, processes, acceptable use policies, all that kind of stuff. Identification, right? So you identify that you actually have an incident or an event occurring. So you first have to detect it. A lot of times then you have to do a quick analysis. So we don't mean dive full deep into this and this phase. This is more of, what is it? Is it ransomware? Is it DOS? Is it DDoS? Is it business email compromise? Is it phishing? Where is it? What's the scope? That's sort of what you're trying to determine, so that you then know, what is going to be my next process? What can I go ahead and do to do some short-term mitigative efforts versus long-term? So then you move straight into containment. So one of the things that's a little bit different from the public safety professional space and the IT space is that IT are taught you need to identify and contain first. Then you make appropriate notifications. So in public safety, it's notify first and or in direct parallel. And sometimes if you have a massive IT support staff, if you're like a big, and I'm going to call Charlotte Mecklenburg out, if you have a ton of people in your shop where you can do those things in parallel, a lot of organizations will do that. And that's, recommended to do what is best for your organization based on the impact that you are seeing. But majority of us are taught you will contain and mitigate first and foremost. So that might be, you get an assessment of what's going on. I've got ransomware in my organization's network. What is being impacted? I am taking everything off the network. That's my step one. Not shutting things down, key point. Not shutting a computer down, not shutting a system down. I'm removing it from the network that is exposed to the incident or the attack, if you will. Then I am alerting the proper authorities by whatever process makes sense. So for us, a lot of times it's going to be internal first. Let me get my internal executive leadership involved. Let me make recommendations as the IT professional based on the scope of who we should include. So does this warrant itself to, say, the Joint Cybersecurity Task Force? Do I need federal, state, local partners and their subject matter expertise or their potential for resources to help me solve this problem? Or is this more, all right, I've got a bunch of phishing emails. Looks like I may have had one or two email accounts that may have had some credential harvesting, but I can pull them all back. I can do my own internal threat hunting, continue with the assessment, and then decide if it needs to elevate. And then, of course, we move into eradication. So that's removing the bad guys from your network, from your system, and then restoration recovery. So in the cyberspace, I think something that's really important for those that are public safety professionals that are on the line is to really understand it's slower. So to really and truly recover your network in the most safest way possible, you pretty much have to wipe everything. You have to start over from zero. You usually rebuild your network in a more secure way, especially if the way in which the perpetrators got in was because of some massive vulnerability or holes, or say your organization's on legacy infrastructure. So say you're still using Windows 7 servers or computers or older Windows servers like 2003 we've seen in some of our incident responses. Those are no longer supported. So every day that they sit operating on a network, they're vulnerable. But maybe you have to have a Windows 7 machine or a 2003 server because it runs a business application that's critical to your organization's operations. So that might have to be a risk that you assume. So there's a lot that goes into, incident response from the cyberspace. It's a little bit different from public safety. I mean, for us, recovery, yeah, it can take a really long time if we have a devastating hurricane like Florence. I mean, people are still recovering. But a lot of times, it's a bad fire or it's an immediate life-threatening incident, and then we can usually recover in a matter of hours to days. Cyber, it's not like that. It's typically a 4 to 6 week recovery time frame, and that's just for basic operations to be stood back up. So they're still recovering 3, 6 months, even sometimes a year out. We still have some municipal governments and county governments that are still recovering from events that happened 7 months ago as far as fully, but they're back with basic operations. So I think that's just important to note some of the differences, and for IT and public safety personnel to realize that there's a lot in common, but to understand the differences and the needs. So talking about the task force, thank you, Greg. These are just some of the things that we do on Blue Sky Days. So I see some of our participants in here are actually with the Nickel Jesus Strike Team. They are critical to our response, both on the ESF2 side and Greg's shop, to the cybersecurity space of the Joint Cybersecurity Task Force. So they're, IT professionals, both municipal, county, governments, all throughout the state, and they help from anything and everything that we need in both spaces. So, we're making those relationships on that Blue Sky Day, like Greg said, having coffee, having conversations so that we know each other's faces and we can trust those relationships. We also are continually doing trainings between the North Carolina National Guard, my section with North Carolina Emergency Management, North Carolina Department of Technology, like the Cyber Symposium that we're doing right now, and Nickel Jesus has their own office hours, their own sessions, their own conferences. And these are all just free trainings for IT professionals and public safety professionals like all of you. Additionally, there's a lot of cybersecurity assessment tools and resources that we have to bring to bear. So let's see, Greg, I think we can move to the next slide, please.
So I think the next slide's the thank you slide. So
yeah, that's okay, because I think we're running, so they can just I can keep talking.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah,
okay.
If you want to, we can open for questions. We got about 2 minutes.
Yeah, so the only other thing I wanted to kind of point out, I just wanted you guys to have longer time to get my email because I want you to connect with me. But essentially, most of what that task force does, it's made up of federal, state, local partners. So we have FBI, we have Secret Service, we have Department of Homeland Security, both the intelligence and analysis section, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency members. We also have, I mentioned Nickel Jesus, National Guard, EM, Greg's shop with ESF2, especially if it impacts anything in the PSAP communication world, they're involved. There were several instances of phone carriers that are impacted a lot. Most of you probably just heard of the recent bandwidth.com DOS event. So there's a lot of interaction and crossover between our sections. But to also paint a picture, we provide incident response and recovery efforts. So for anyone that qualifies under critical infrastructure, which I believe is probably everybody on this call, if you work for county government, municipal, city governments, if you are assigned to a critical infrastructure sector, like say an energy sector, like Duke Energy, or a fuel petroleum industry, those services are free to you. So we don't have any other goal other than helping you get back to some sense of normal if you are impacted from a cyber incident. So, we just want you to know that we exist, know that we have a lot of resources and subject matter experts that can help you in any process. And we recognize that it's not a matter of if, it's more of a matter of when it comes to cybersecurity, just because of the interconnected nature. You could be the best IT professional, the best IT professional shop, do everything right, and you can still be impacted by a cybersecurity incident. And that is something that we have had to work really hard on the public safety side of helping to educate a lot of our emergency managers, a lot of our county managers, that this is not an IT professional's fault that this is happening. I mean, sometimes, very rare, but a very small percent is from negligence or lack of doing something that they're supposed to do. It's usually because the IT is one person and they can only do, so much, and they're doing everything right, and it just, things happen. So that's something that Greg mentioned earlier with verbiage and communication and education and understanding the spaces. And I know we've been separating you guys pretty much through this presentation, but I would really like to say that we're all public safety professionals when you think about it. I mean, IT is so critical in everything that we do that you all are public safety professionals, which is why we're having this conversation. You are mission critical to everything in the world. So I just wanted to make that point very clear, and we're really grateful for everything that you all do. And thanks for letting us kind of talk at you this morning, and I hope you got more coffee. So
Yeah, thanks everybody. Greatly honored to have the opportunity to take part in this. Thanks, Albert.
Yes, we did have a question here. If you have time to field it before we go, the question was, I think a system of cipher would help law enforcement in my world do that all the time. Do you think it could help in the medic situation? And I don't know if you know what scenario that applies to from your presentation.
So I think it's the MDT discussion, but I'm a radio guy, so I'll pass that along. I'm a radio voice encryption guy, so.
Would you mind repeating the question, Albert?
The question said, I think a system of a cipher would help. Law enforcement officers in my world do that all the time. Do you think it could help in the medic situation?
Is there, who answered the question? Would you mind providing a little more clarification of exactly, are you asking if you think a cipher would benefit, or are you more or less asking something around the education piece of, clicking on random links and within that, mobile data terminal, and trying to educate some of the public safety, like medic partners, fire partners? I'm trying to understand exactly.
I think what I'm going to do is ask the submitter here to reach out to one of the email addresses that you have up there, and we'll see if we can get a clarification on that question and get an answer to the participant there. We thank you for the presentation. It was jam-packed with lots of information. I know I learned a bunch, and I hope that our audience did. Again, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.